Hello, everyone. I'm Ksenia Chmutina, and I'm director of the Institute of Advanced Studies. Welcome to Gestation Week. We're so excited that finally, we're here in London, and we get to spend a week together thinking, discussing, exploring, debating everything to do with gestation. As some of you may know, the Institute of the Advanced Studies is the place at Loughborough University where we have exciting conversations, where we are free to speak and debate, and it's wonderful to have so many amazing people joining us. This seminar is running in hybrid mode, so there are quite a few here of us today in the room, and there are also quite a few of us online. We will be recording the conversation. Please post your questions online. We are monitoring the chat. But the question and answer session will not be released as a part of the recording. This conversation will also be released as a podcast. So today we're having a conversation actually with Dr. Sophie Lewis, and it will be facilitated by Dr. Victoria Browne and Dr. Jilly Boyce. Okay, but before we move to the conversation, I'd like pass over to Dr. Pandora Ziporek to do the introduction.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll save my sort of broader thoughts and observations about the larger gestation theme until Wednesday's roundtables. But yeah, I'm Pandora Ziporek. I'm a Leverhulme early career research fellow here at Loughborough University London, and a visiting fellow at the V&A. And along with my co-leads on the theme of gestation, bodies, technologies, ecologies, justice, Dr. Anna Christina Suzina, Dr. Emma Pullen, and Dr. Eleanor Morgan. I guess I just say on everybody's behalf how excited we are, looking forward to the week's events. Starting with the present one, and very excited to have Dr. Sophie Lewis here today. Sophie's work has been really inspirational in the development of this theme, and has been an influence on my thinking and the thinking of my colleagues across the university, so including Dr. Victoria Browne, who's in philosophy, and Dr. Jilly Boyce, Senior Lecturer in Communication and Media. So yeah, just to say, I'm looking forward to hearing about Sophie's new forthcoming book, Enemy Feminisms, as well as Victoria and Jilly's work in the same area, reactionary feminisms. And also just to mention that I think both Jilly and Victoria actually, they're relatively recent colleagues who have actually started since we proposed this theme. And I think that's a testament to the importance of this theme, of this burgeoning area of research in Loughborough across the different institutes, departments, and schools. So also to mention, this area of research is feeding into a newly starting research hub in social justice and inequality here at Loughborough, London, as well as a newly formed research group on gender, sexuality, and feminism, also in the school. So hopefully this is feeding into much more important, relevant research to come. And I will also just mention that after this panel, there will be tea and coffee outside, and it will be followed by an event presented by Radar, a screening by the artist Rihanna Zaman. And some of you may have noticed that there's been some action around Loughborough divesting from supporting apartheid and genocide in Palestine. And after Rihanna's screening, there will also be a teach-in event downstairs with the scholar Lena Ashur from SOAS speaking to Palestinian feminist activism. So that's without further ado, I pass it over to you.
Hello, thanks I should talk into here because of the recording, right, the Zoom. I don't think I need it, but
You don't need to.
okay.
But you can.
I need 3 hands, really. Thank you so much for being here. You know what? Yes. I'm giving a short version, very sort of a sliver of every few paragraphs of the introduction to my new book. I hope it hits the main points. It's kind of sucked out all of the personal auto theory stuff. This is the cover reveal. You're actually the first people to see it. Thank you. I'm just going to go for it. Women are not horrible, said the artist Jenny Holzer in an interview in 2023 in answer to a question about the future of the feminist movement. If Holzer could speak to her former self, she went on, she would advise the young Jenny not to feel guilty for making feminism a constant out loud focus. Implicit in Holzer's statement is the idea that if women were horrible, it would make sense to be apologetic about being a feminist. So in a way, it's lucky that women aren't horrible because our non-horribleness is part of what legitimizes a full-throated feminist position. We're largely not the problem, Holzer repeated. I think I know why feminists say this and why we believe it, not least because I've spent about 20 years doing so myself. But women are horrible and women are not horrible are really two sides of the same coin, and both are bad reasons to do feminism. The one claim merely reverses the other, leaving intact the premise that gendered oppression is some kind of public relations matter, a question of people misjudging the group in question or its inherent value. Pedestals and pillories, exculpatory and incriminating gestures have both been part of the construction of womanhood for a long time, and touting women's innocence or niceness relative to men doesn't get us out of that circuit. It's not liberatory, it's similarly dehumanizing as saying women suck. Why would women not be horrible? Aren't they part of history? When I was 31, a lot of women yelled at me that women are not horrible. A newspaper editor had asked me to write an op-ed that would introduce American readers to trans-exclusionary radical feminism, a phenomenon that had dominated mainstream discussions of gender justice in this country for years. The hook was a 2019 trip to Washington, D.C., funded by the right-wing Heritage Foundation, a small group of feminists from Britain who protested transgender ideology by collaring the trans national press secretary of the Human Rights Campaign, Sarah McBride. Stop the erasure of the female, the uninvited female rights activists had shouted while filming McBride's dismay on their cell phones. This species of anti-trans hostility was, in 2019, to many Americans, something new, no longer. Why was feminism in Britain this paranoid, the editors wanted to know, about an existential threat that trans women pose to cis women, when no comparably resourced anti-trans feminism even existed in the US. I should say I've lived on and off in the States since 2011. I sound like I come from the UK, but in fact, I just can persuade US editors that I know all about TERF Island. I've lived there continuously since 2017 as well. I tried my best to answer, right, what is going on. I explained that a national culture of no-nonsense anti-utopianism prevails on TERF Island, and that the, quote, commitment to misery, to being a bloody difficult woman, unquote, notably by mocking and blocking others' attempts at self-actualization, as writer Asa Sarrazin puts it, is one of the main things driving the stubborn insistence on anti-trans prejudice here. Obviously, it's not universal. I feel like I'm feeling defensive on your behalf at this point. Anyway, that's the context I said, in which UK feminists routinely frame gender as somehow self-indulgent and frivolous. To have or mention, let alone reinvent, a gender identity is for TERFs a form of individualism that holds ordinary women in contempt. This posture allows them to tell themselves that their opposition to National Health Service provisions for trans people constitutes punching up instead of down. It's a narrative of righteous self-defense against rapacious neoliberal invasion, but in its panic mongering about gender fluid foreignness, it also fuses with a much older British feminism of fear. There we go. The construct of the trans woman freighted with sexual menace is one that imagines her not only as an unwoman, but as fundamentally un-British too. European xenophobia, more broadly, has frequently used, I think, anti-Americanism as the more acceptable cover for feelings about aliens more generally. I hence hear strong echoes in TERFism of 2 centuries worth of proudly Anglo-Saxon feminist participation in eugenicist colonial efforts to clean up messy gender and prostitution in colonies like British India, where there were substantial populations of non-cisgender indigenes. So bottom line, the biggest reason for British feminism's disproportionate transphobia is empire. I knew in advance that ridiculing this kind of claim, ridiculing anti-racism, or at least imagining it as necessary for Americans only, is the official sport of Britain's intellectual establishment. But it was still a shock when furious TERFs told me that women were not involved in that whole empire thing. For the TERFs dogpiling my op-ed, not only does trans activism undermine feminism writ large, but feminist criticism from the left of feminism is anti-feminism. Ooh, my American accent. Anti-feminism. It silences women, or so the silenced women in question tell the world every day on talk shows or in the pages of The Guardian, and since circa 2021, the New York Times. The cry of censorship distracts from what is in reality simply a refusal to engage with unwelcome lessons. Of course, it's not anti-woman per se to explore how European feminists were active in colonial governance, for instance, in the policing of gender via eugenic education, or in sexual hygiene, policy, and missionary work. It is a vital feminist process. But in the face of the West's cultural allergy to this kind of self-knowledge regarding women's involvement in empire, scores of historians have had to create an entire academic field. The jury really is in. Middle and upper class ladies especially participated feministly in racial domination on a planetary scale. Only by facing these truths can feminism become accountable to itself, mutate accordingly, and thrive. Yet in the stubbornly defensive minds of the West's decorated public intellectuals, national treasures, talking heads, and curriculum writers, to bring this stuff up is to display craven ingratitude, rank hypocrisy, bad taste, and a dishonorable capitulation to today's woke decolonial youth tyranny. Now, obviously, I number among the card-carrying allies of these phantasmatic upstarts, the young people fighting for their bodily autonomy, the ones that TERFs called, blue-haired bullies, as though they have the power to oppress their educators. I've just done a slide to introduce those of you who might not know who I am to what I do. I write essays. I'm a recovering academic, or otherwise known as a writer. So I would say that all this said, not long ago, I understand profoundly the impulse to attack critiques of feminism. The temptation is really strong to immediately say, okay, but feminists clearly aren't the main culprits here. What about anti-feminists' much, much bigger role in all the bad shit you're talking about? The valid concerns embedded in these objections still do not justify institutionalized avoidance of the topic. If these oppressors, the feminist ones, are such a minor thread in human history, then what's wrong with getting to the bottom of their oppressing? Women are horrible quite often. Feminists even are part of the problem. That's what the book is about. Because I think we have no choice but to name enemy feminisms if we are to build an abundant and livable world while calling that project feminism, which I do want to do. We have to let go of the comforts of both self-castigation and defensiveness. No girl bosses, no heroines, no masters. For centuries, women are not the problem has been an eminently publishable take from feminists and anti-feminists alike. Contrariwise, many of us on the radical left are glad that so many of us are a problem for the survival of the present state of things. And we dream, in fact, of being a much, much bigger problem. Now, this call for feminist enmity, I suppose, I'm not sure I've ever called it that before. This is kind of my first time presenting this work. So you can imagine how nervous I feel in a sense to be proposing feminist enmity. But it is not about purification. It is not about purity or intolerance and lack of understanding for mistakes. They say, don't they, that to understand all is to forgive all. What I'm saying is that if that is true, then a commitment to impurity in politics, which, by the way, is a commitment I think of as key to anti-fascism, has to walk hand in hand with the courage to draw lines and fight people if necessary, even when they are kin. So in other words, feminists who, like me, are committed anti-fascists, or for anti-fascists who are also feminists, as they must be, need to know the difference between forgiving enemies and giving up the fight against them. It's a question of learning more confidently to oppose people whom we understand. A cop is still my enemy when she's my neighbor. We can still feel compassion for a QAnon mom and liquidate her armory. We can forgive, for whatever that counts for, a pro-life feminist and still destroy the forced birth judiciary. I strongly believe all of us deserve the freedom and safety to be foolish. However, there is another very different sense of the word fool or foolish. It's one I almost used in the title of this book, which at one point was going to be called The Feminism of Fools in this event, which I initially pulled out, actually, which got rescheduled because I pulled out because of the call from Palestine to withdraw academic labor. So this Feminism of Fools title might sound to the uninitiated as though it's only about ignorance, ignorant feminists. And that's why I ended up using enemies instead, because the foolishness in the of fools formulation is an enemy foolishness. There's no sort of aimless head in the sky, radical openness of the kind you might find on the fool card in tarot, right, in the Rider-Waite deck, kind of like that card. What is meant by this foolishness is actually sort of the opposite. It's a comfortable, calcified, willful certainty with regard to what's what, a disavowed incuriosity vis-a-vis the impossible. Now, can one type of fool become the other? Sure, it happens all the time. I've seen utopian fools suddenly seek to get real, grow up, and so on, by rapidly embracing the pseudo-realism of the latter type. And that sort of, I got real, I used to be such a utopian, and then I grew up, is a recurrent theme in reactionary feminist narratives about their conversion to post-liberalism. People like Mary Harrington and Louise Perry, they all talk like that. A century and a half ago, in German-speaking leftist circles, this popular apothegm emerged, and anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. The phrase swiftly went viral, since it so helpfully put a name, in the late 19th century to a pernicious form of xenophobic anti-banker populism that makes hay out of the phobic association between the figure of the quote unquote Jew and finance capital on the one hand, and communism and the quote unquote Jew on the other. So in this socialism of fools, capitalism is finance, is the Jews, but Jews are somehow also trying to undermine nationhood, overthrow class society, and usher in a Marxist world order. This. Thank you, Maddie. Thanks. The soi-disant socialists in question said they loved the working class, but what they actually loved was an idea of artisanal purity and clean living, very different from the slum dwellers, garment factory laborers, and sweatshop rabble of the actual, substantially Yiddish speaking, for obvious reasons, proletariat, right, at that time. And these self-contradicting stories are easy to fall into. Naomi Klein talks about this in Doppelganger. They're easy to fall into even for nominally well-intentioned people under present conditions of rampant dispossession and alienation, but that is not to say that it's somehow only a little bit off. No, the socialism of fools is the royal road to National Socialism. In other words, fascism. What is distinct about the phrase socialism of fools, which kind of names a new sort of, frame, self-described as left anti-Semitism, quite different from the Christian conservative anti-Semitism that prevailed until that point, is that it highlights a kind of tragedy. The original impulse of someone who ends up in this position may have at one point been, bona fide anti-capitalist. Someone may have looked about and said to herself that something is drastically wrong about market society, something that liberal democracy cannot solve. And that much is true. But then instead of persisting towards an understanding of capital as an impersonal system of social relations, something that definitely feels vertiginous, she sort of chokes with the value form too big and individual bosses and property owners too small. She has nothing of the right size toward which she can direct her rage. She finds the feeling of ambiguity intolerable. So she falls into this kind of still subversive feeling, but fundamentally consoling belief that only some of capitalism's modern manifestations are what's wrong. Speculation, debt, usury, human trafficking, greed. Perhaps, she thinks, these evils have a common source in a social parasite preying on what would otherwise be a healthy state of economic nature, characterized by honest labor and fair trade. Perhaps instead of the banal planetary violence that is the class relation, the heart of the matter is more spectacular and easier to visualize. A race of super powerful, yet only indirectly discernible, and somehow also very sort of weak and effeminate aliens, right? A craven fifth column walking amongst us, undermining us, leeching off of us, profiteering. It is sometimes forgotten that fascists understand themselves as an emancipatory anti-elite revolt against politics. Make no mistake, the point here isn't that leftism is somehow closer to fascism than liberalism is. I believe the opposite. But the point is that a fleeting radical instinct or canny inclination towards systemic analysis, or the need for it, can, in some cases, slip, plunge, and turn into an enemy politics. So the point is we can understand various moments in feminist political philosophy over the past 2 centuries in similar terms. Like the socialism of fools, this feminism I'm thinking of typically began with some kind of radical impulse. In each case, women said to themselves, okay, something is deeply wrong in gendered life, something that humanism as we know it cannot solve. True. Instead of them persisting, though, towards an understanding of gender itself as unnatural all the way down, which certainly can feel vertiginous, they cop out. Divisions like productive, reproductive, and private, public feel rather abstract, while individual workplaces, be it the hearth where unwaged care happens, or the waged domestic sphere, or the call center, or the commercial kitchen feel overly specific. It would be easier to be able to paint a picture of our tormentor, wouldn't it? So maybe we can all agree that some of gender's manifestations are bad. Prostitution, femness, transfemininity, contract pregnancy, oriental patriarchy, intimate partner violence, sexed access, bars to education, the pay gap, stigma on abortion, imagined lack of stigma on abortion. Any one of these things can surely be attacked, for starters, right? In the name of a sex egalitarian world. Easier anyway than figuring out what unmaking the mode of production that underlies the logic of gender would entail. Easier to visualize the problem as a glass ceiling, a wage differential, an office sex pest, a pimp, a foreign rapist, a male doctor, a husband's drunkenness, the penis, or gender ideology. We can destroy these things, maybe, right? By legislating against outrages to motherhood and girlhood, against porn, the veil, sex work, sexual misconduct, intemperance. I've got sexual misconduct twice. Workplace discrimination, or trans self-determination. Okay, I kind of wrote this book because I wish that I had had a concept like the feminism of fools 20 years ago, because no one ever explained to me when I was cutting my teeth as a feminist in my late teens that certain feminisms actively wreak a great deal of evil. And as a result, I spent over a decade, certainly, equating feminism with good politics in a world that reflected anything but. I simply pushed down my unease, just like all the other feminists around me, plumping for this strategy. Whenever I encountered reactionaries calling themselves feminist, something that happened disconcertingly often, I would breezily define them as non-feminist. That's not real feminism, I'd say. Whatever they may think, these people aren't feminists. In order to count, a feminism has to fill some kind of criteria to do with anti-racism and anti-capitalism. This purgative approach is understandably really popular. As far as I know, pretty much all my friends do it sometimes, and it's easy to understand why. Because, you know, for one thing, clarifying that, you know, these so-called feminists do not speak for me is a valuable form of solidarity with the hardest hit victims of imperial feminism or girl bossery. When we say that's not feminism, we're letting the harmful pro-woman actors know that they are not our people, while letting their targets know we have their back. For example, civilizing crusaders against the hijab aren't feminists, we affirm, building our barricades around the term. Whorephobic humanitarians aren't feminists. If you're a racist rape prosecutor like New York's head of sex crimes in 1989, Linda Fairstein, you aren't a real feminist. If you're a kink shamer, you're not doing feminism. Pro-life feminism, no such thing. Or as some wags have proposed, TERFs aren't even feminists, they're farts, feminism appropriating radical trans votes. At the time of writing, a web search for the term not really feminism, as I showed you, right, returns over 100,000 results. Our uneasiness here is palpable. Do we even know when real feminism began? It turns out the word itself was likely coined a few years after Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, right? A treatise itself preceded by the French revolutionary Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Women. Meanwhile, you know, good anthologies of feminism nowadays tend to provincialize the Western canon altogether and begin anywhere in the last 4,000 years, perhaps with undated Cheyenne proverbs or Apache storytelling, or an invocation by the Sumerian priestess and Hejuana, verses by Sappho, selections from the Hebrew Bible, or poems from the Therigatha, a collection written by Buddhist nuns. But the original self-styled feminism, as I love to remind people as a card-carrying family abolitionist, is this early 19th century, French utopian socialist and sex liberationist who wanted to abolish the family, called Charles Fourier. While Anglophone histories typically start the story with Wollstonecraft and her vindication of bourgeois motherhood, don't get me wrong, she also made feminism synonymous with support for the French Revolution, kudos, etc. But, she vindicated the reverse from Fourier, who wanted to abolish, as I say, the private nuclear household. How can a single movement's two parents want such opposite things? The disunity, even just of Western, colonial feminisms. He was a colonialist as well. Wollstonecraft talking about how feminism is there to strengthen British Empire. They don't differ on that kind of desire, on thinking that desirable. This disunity is a source of great subliminal anxiety to today's feminists. And no wonder, in the context of new awareness forced on our collective memory, not that the knowledge itself is new, obviously, by Black Lives Matter, movements in the streets, right? Several figures in the authorized woman suffrage pantheon have come into unrosy focus lately as committed white supremacists. Traditional accounts about the foremothers of the Western women's movement are stuck in our collective gullets. Many of us learned, I did you, about those brave blue stockings, right, who stepped out from the private sphere and said, no, we will not be slaves, even while ostensibly supporting other people's struggles to break actual slave chains around their ankles. It's a tale most of us know, I think, that a vindication was bourgeois revolutionary feminism's opening gambit in English. But it's still worth recalling that its core proposition, penned in the midst of the Haitian Revolution, is that domesticated Western women are in a comparable situation to enslaved Africans laboring in the Caribbean, and thus they're deserving of social emancipation like them, or possibly more so. Wollstonecraft's opposition to real slavery was sincere, if not meaningfully anti-racist. Her overarching argument was that one should oppose European gentlewomen's lack of access to education because one already opposes the colonial system of slave labor, because one cares about colonialism's ultimate glory. We have this conceptual strategy to thank for kickstarting the past 233 years of liberal democratic gender progress. Organized bourgeois womanhood taking inspiration from anti-colonial struggle and then seeking to take precedence over it persists as a pattern to this day, as several books pointed out in 2021. And the massive uptick in conversations about white feminism in recent years proves that many feminists in the West are chewing on the legacy of the slave analogy, or the slavery analogy. A massive surge in anti-white feminist discussion indicates some real willingness on the part of nice white ladies, as Jessie Daniels calls us, to unlearn imperial feminism. Many have sought tools to help them identify the unmarked, baked-in settler chauvinism and anti-Blackness in their self-empowerment networks. From 2016 on especially, thousands have flocked to lectures and teach-ins and workshops on decolonization, decolonizing feminism, and so on, by Black feminists like Gail Lewis in the UK, while in the US, abolition feminism seems to gain new recruits every day. We had Ruth Wilson Gilmore on the featured in the New York Times. That's something that Black Lives Matter achieved. Naturally, the publishing industry reflected all of this, and these useful books on feminist whiteness appeared, as I say, 3 years ago. So Kyla Schuller's The Trouble with White Women, Jessie Daniels, Nice White Ladies, Ruby Hamad's White Skin, Brown Scars, and Rafia Zakaria's Against White Feminism. Even the former editor of Vogue, Koa Beck, published a book that year called White Feminism, From the Suffragettes to the Influencers and Who They Leave Behind. But actually, the problem with white feminist politics is not what it fails to address and whom it leaves out, writes Kyla Schuller in a gentle corrective to Beck's frame. White feminism is an active form of harm, not simply a byproduct of self-absorption. Hence, expanding white feminism's tent will not transform the materials of which it is made, unquote. Unsurprisingly, a counter-revolutionary rash of $30,000 an hour consultants such as Robin DiAngelo tried to transform these suddenly self-conscious and guilty materials into cash, co-opting the critique of feminist whiteness into a practice of white feminist self-castigation. Make no mistake, whiteness cannot be disentangled from any of the enemy feminisms I seek to illuminate, right? The feminism of anti-Islam, the feminism of bosses, the feminism of forced gestating, the feminism of cisness, and more. It gives me hope that so many of us are now coming to grips with the co-imbrication of gender and racialization. My worry, though, following Schuller and others, is that it seems easier for the culture to talk about white feminism as a simple matter of things that were done by feminists who are white, than it is to wrestle with the notion of a feminism that has whiteness baked into its very core. White feminism is a valuable concept. In some hands, however, it has an ambiguity to it that capitalism already exploits. Can you lose the whiteness without fatally damaging the feminism? What if, as some people seem to secretly hope, there's no way to stop being white at all? So all you can aspire to do is be an ally and apologize sufficiently or whatever. So for those who would prefer to meditate on their privileges forever instead of picking a side and committing to race treachery, right, i.e. what the abolitionist John Browne called loyalty to mankind, too much talk of white feminism can become demobilizing and indulgent. At the same time, some manifestations of ethno-nationalism, pro-whiteness, class domination, and coloniality in feminist form are not actually identified as bad feminism often enough on account of the ethnic characteristics of their stakeholders, or, so think of Japanese TERFs or Hindu femo-nationalists. As Gloria Anzaldúa remarked long ago, some whites, quote, possess women of color consciousness, just as some women of color bear white consciousness, unquote. Feminists committed racist mistakes and their feminisms reflected errors of judgment. This much, at least, we've been dragged kicking and screaming to recognize, I think. But the culture still shows reluctance to contemplate the extent of some feminism's deeper theoretic intertwinements with fascism. What we need now is a bestiary of enemy feminisms to jolt us into understanding that a woman's cry for women's power is sometimes part and parcel of the oppressor's program. Even as we suffer loss in the short term, we can, and there is likely to be feelings of loss around this. We can ultimately only gain as feminists when we accept that certain beloved old lines and lineages of feminism weren't just incidentally misogynist, but substantively so, right? Feminist misogyny. That their core definitions were bourgeois irremediably, that their racism was non-excisable. What are our other options after all? Shall we attempt the bonkers task of calling in people with opposite aims to our own and decolonizing what is squarely a form of colonialism? Or shall we break up the house of feminism, that battered and beloved fortress where so many of us have not lived well, and dare to call some feminism's enemies? Contra the aggrieved cries from certain quarters, such as the New Left Review, that it can only ever be patriarchy that benefits when feminists criticize other feminists, I affirm with Anzaldúa that lines of affinity, not identity, must be drawn. Some feminisms are obstacles to gender freedom, and asking which side are you on is the most elemental level of political physics. The side of woman does not exist. It never did. Let's be brave and take our bitter medicine. Feminists across the political spectrum have taken pains to define their troops as chaste and untainted by lust, especially interracial lust, not to mention maternal, i.e. Pure, straight, removed from the realm of productive work, and natural, i.e. not artificial, not femme, neither surgically nor chemically enhanced. Black feminism feminisms have a better track record, but of course, some Black feminisms too have been thoroughly ableist in this way, or whorephobic or anti-communist. All in all, a great deal of feminism has imagined its central subject as hardworking, non-disabled, healthful, and prosthesis-free, these being the unspoken complements to a womanhood that is life-giving, or at least pro-family, economically independent, or at least aspiring, non-violent, or at least law-abiding, and self-respecting, i.e. not a body modifier or a bottom. All of this was feminism, not liberatory feminism, but feminism in the sense that it contested a patriarchal constraint placed upon a certain group of women, no matter how few. Victorious aristo-feminists proceeded to co-engineer and enforce patriarchal or eugenic constraints for others. They even expect generalized feminist support for these accessions. Is this worse than a hypothetical gentleman-only alternate domination? No. But nor is such equal opportunity inequality, such counter-revolutionary fairness, remotely what my team is fighting for. We need to be discerning about any given feminism precisely because feminism is so capacious that it comprises within itself its own mortal enemies. I say this as a reluctant feminist killjoy because I belong to feminism. It is thanks to, and despite people like Wollstonecraft, both, that feminism can be a force of reaction, even as it is an insurgent force that materially creates the right to the city, filling the streets with choreographies and chants, denouncing cops, courts, bosses, and the state. Feminism is necessarily central to any meaningful anti-fascism, but this does not mean that it is always anti-fascist or even non-fascist. We can't just bank on that. Rather, our task is to conspire towards a world where women, if that word still exists, will still be horrible and not horrible, but where counter-revolutionary feminism has been stripped of its capacity for violence, and where even our feminism is happily obsolete. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sophie. In what follows, Victoria and I are going to provide some responses. So we both had the privilege of reading the manuscript, which I think we both feel extremely privileged to have been able to do. The way it's going to work, I think Victoria will speak first we're going to sort of respond from our respective positions in political philosophy and communication and media, and then I think we'll speak for 5 or 10 minutes each, and then open it up for Q&A. So I'll hand over to you, Victoria. Thanks. A bit like a boy band. Yeah. Okay, so yes, thank you so much for sending us the early copy. This really wonderful book, and we've both really enjoyed reading it. So there is so much to take from each chapter. So 12 chapters, and so much research has gone into this book. There's so much knowledge, so many insights in each chapter. I thought I would just highlight one chapter that I particularly appreciated, which is chapter 11 on pro-life or anti-abortion feminism. And that's because it's something I've worked on myself. And so in my case, I was partly spurred on to write about this precisely because of this claim that there is no such thing as anti-abortion feminism. So what happened is I got interested in it
when I was listening to a US podcast just after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and I heard a young woman being interviewed who described herself as a pro-life feminist. And as I was listening, I found myself actually agreeing with a few of the things she was saying. So, for example, when she pointed out the hypocrisy of Republican-controlled states seeking to, hurrying to introduce abortion bans, but at the same time failing to increase services and support for pregnant and birthing people, childcare, and so on. So I became really intrigued by this political position, partly because it did feel so kind of counterintuitive to me, but then I found myself agreeing with certain parts of it. So I started doing some research, and then I was at a reproductive justice conference, and I was talking to an academic who works on abortion, and I said that I was thinking of writing a piece on anti-abortion feminism, and she just kind of snorted and said, "Oh, there's no such thing," and she was just completely dismissive of the whole idea. And I was left thinking, but it is a thing. I mean, even if it doesn't have that many adherents, it does still exist. And I really felt that this very kind of dismissive, or you call it purgative, attitude or response was really stopping us from getting to grips with anti-abortion feminism and really coming to understand its different variations, its logics, its tactics. And I think it's important to do that if we really want to properly, oppose it and hopefully defeat it. So I really appreciated that you properly engaged with pro-life feminism in this chapter, when so many do kind of dismiss it and say there is no such thing. And I thought it was a really good demonstration of how to show, the poverty of the politics of this kind of feminism and the kind of facileness of its ethics, which you do really well there. So I really appreciated that chapter.
Thank you.
I also really appreciated the historical chapters in the first part. I mean, there's some entertaining passages in there for sure. And yeah, so I thought they really demonstrated very clearly the ideological intertwinement of European colonial feminisms with racist, eugenicist, imperial projects. So in political philosophy, which is my kind of official discipline, I guess, it's been so common to kind of explain away the racist, imperialist bits of feminist thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft as being a kind of historical or sociological footnote. And it's a kind of contextualist argument that basically says, well, it's no wonder if thinkers like Wollstonecraft said racist things and imperialist things, look at the times in which they were writing. Basically, they couldn't really help it, but it doesn't matter because we can kind of strip out the bits we don't like and extract the kind of core philosophical, timeless feminist bit. And I think it just shows so well, the book shows so well how we can't just kind of edit out the bits we don't like, because they are a core part of the ideological package. And you say that, yeah, these kind of feminisms aren't just incidentally racist, they're substantively so. And I think that's a really good line that kind of summarizes part of the project here. So I really appreciated that. And these kind of arguments have been made in political philosophy, particularly in relation to the kind of great, canonical philosopher men like Kant and Hegel and so on. So it's really good to see them being made in relation to feminist thinkers like Wollstonecraft. So they don't get let off the hook just because they're feminists, right? So I thought they were really great chapters as well. Okay, so time for the questions. So I do have lots of questions. I'm not going to ask them all now, don't worry. But some of the questions I have coalesce really around the politics of drawing lines and this task of identifying who we can kind of think and work with, and then conversely who needs to be kind of thought and worked against. And I'm thinking about this particularly in relation to the reproductive justice movement, which has so often been framed as a kind of broad church coalition. So Loretta Ross, for example, consistently describes it this way. So she's clear that there's no room within the reproductive justice movement for anti-abortion feminists that support the criminalization of abortion.
Yeah.
But it seems that she doesn't see all pro-life feminists as necessarily enemy feminists. So one example I'm thinking of is a book that she edited on reproductive justice in 2017. And this book includes a chapter by a pro-life feminist called Mary Ann Durr. So Durr argues against legal abortion bans. So she argues against criminalization, but at the same time, she does think that abortion is morally wrong, and she thinks that we should be working towards its elimination. And Ross says that they included this chapter in the book because they wanted to show that reproductive justice is, you know, a broad movement that can include lots of diverse perspectives, including perspectives that the editors themselves disagreed with. And Ross has now got her whole calling in project.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so she said, so this is a project where she's arguing that we have to be kind of looking at calling in our political opponents rather than calling them out. And she said it's about trying to convince people with different politics that they aren't each other's enemies. And that's a quote from a New York Times interview that she did. And so I'm just wondering how this kind of approach sits in relation to the more militant approach, I think that's growing amongst other pro-abortion feminists who are really starting to articulate the position that actually framing abortion as being something that is up for ethical debate is part of the problem. And so I'm thinking particularly of you know, the wonderful essay by Charlotte Shane, The Right Not to Be Pregnant. So she says here that from now on, we have to match the intensity and focus of our foes and meet absolutism with absolutism. So this, I think, this line really chimes with the kind of core argument that you're articulating in Enemy Feminisms. And you said just now in your presentation, and something I noted in the introduction, where you say, the task of calling in people with opposite aims to our own is bonkers. So yeah, so I guess my question is just how you see the Enemy Feminisms framework or approach kind of sitting in relation to that kind of more broad church approach that's been articulated and practiced by Ross. And that's not to say, you know, I don't want to kind of characterize the broad church approach as being a kind of mushy liberalism, you know, it's not that.
No.
But I'd love to hear if you see that there's any tension there, or how they relate to one another. So I'll pass to you.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Great, shall I? Yeah. I'll go next. Okay. Yes, so thank you. And again, to reiterate that this book is really beautifully written and sort of wonderfully engaging takedown of this notion that feminism is this inherently a political good. And so I've been thinking about it and reading about it from my sort of position within feminist media and cultural studies, and thinking about how this book can really help us to think through some of the maybe foundational ways of thinking about the way that feminism particularly sort of manifests in media and popular culture. And I think there is a tendency within feminist media and cultural studies, which I've certainly been part of and sort of been socialized into precisely understanding feminism as inherently progressive, as inherently benign. Where there is a problem, it's just that it's limited, it hasn't gone far enough. And what this book I think is so valuable at doing is taking down that notion and actually showing how it's, you know, it's precisely co-implicated, co-productive, thoroughly entangled with the kind of with certain, you know, reactionary conservative politics. And so for example, there's in feminist media and cultural studies, there's really excellent work, which I use a lot by scholars such as Angela McRobbie and Rosalind Gill and Sarah Benny-Weiser and others, who think about the problem with feminism as it manifests in popular media and culture, is that it's sort of hyper individualistic, and what we need to get back to is, and it's therefore kind of like politically powerless, it's kind of toothless, it only exists at the level of visibility and it doesn't really go any further. And therefore the response should be that what we need is more of a collective feminism. We need a kind of angrier type of feminism, which is kind of more substantive, more powerful, that doesn't merely call for individual empowerment, but struggles towards a different kind of society. And I think what's really valuable in Sophie's book is that it is illuminating a problem with this, is in that for many enemy feminisms, such as TERFism, individualism is also posed as being a problem. So as Sophie already mentioned, gender critical feminists see gender identity as a form of individualism that holds ordinary women in contempt. And many of these enemy feminisms, are not sort of only individualistic. They also have this vision of a kind of ideal social order, such as these women who, as you say so beautifully, have participated feministly in racial domination on a planetary scale. So I think what the book does is point to some of maybe the limitations and some of the theoretical tools that we have for understanding how feminism can be problematic. And I was also thinking there's so many wonderful chapters, but some of the ones that I've focused on are the chapter on girl boss feminism, and which thinks about figures such as Beyonce, for example. And so Beyonce is a big figure in feminist media and cultural studies, and the way that figures such as Beyonce are often seen as sort of very ambivalent for feminism. So on the one hand, they bring some kind of good politics, ideas of kind of visibility, recognition, and so on, but then also sort of these neoliberal ideas of the girl boss. But so I was just thinking about, so I guess in my area, we often think about these kinds of popular feminisms as being kind of ambivalent rather than kind of enemy, and so I guess it was so it'd be really interesting to hear about how it's really tying into what Victoria is saying as well about the how where the line is drawn, the politics of where that line is drawn between is it the feminist or is it the feminism? And it would be great to hear more about in the book. There's a really interesting and important discussion of bell hooks, who's obviously incredibly important for feminist thinking. But you also talk in the book about how many feminists can't really get their heads around the fact or really wrestle with the fact that bell hooks was also advocated for landlordism as a kind of feminist strategy. So I'd be interested to hear about how somebody like how we might think about bell hooks as in this conversation, and coming from media studies, I'm also really curious to know what you think the kind of the role of media is, or the kind of the conjuncturally specific moment we're in, where so many of these enemy feminisms are kind of circulating and becoming visible through social media and taking shape within these social media networks. And obviously it's not it's not a new phenomenon, as you show so beautifully in the book. There's very long histories of how enemy feminisms have developed, but what might it be about the particular conjuncture that we're in that means it may be taking shape in certain ways? And so I guess that I'm thinking about this in relation to my current work, which is I'm looking at how there are certain sort of female-centric communities online which have taken shape almost like in sort of direct response to like the manosphere.
Yeah.
So in the manosphere, you have like these communities like incels, pickup artists, men going their own way. And in response to that, you've got these sort of female-centric communities which have sprung up ostensibly in sort of opposition to these communities. So you get like femcells, women who identify as involuntary celibates, with female dating strategists, women going their own way. And there seems to be a kind of mirroring dynamic going on there, so if I just focus on one of those communities, there's a community called the Female Dating Strategy, and they began on Reddit, and they ostensibly began because they wanted to kind of fight back against the manosphere and the mainstreaming of kind of misogynistic dating practices of kind of like gaslighting, negging, these kind of manipulative tactics that men were increasingly using in heterosexual dating culture. And so the Female Dating Strategy started up, and they wanted to kind of fight back and explicitly call themselves feminist. A bit like you, Victoria, I was listening to a podcast one day by the Female Dating Strategy, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. It's this new feminist podcast for you know, I have some friends who could listen to this. They need some strategies for how to deal with dating, because it's so awful for so many people. So using like the language of feminism, sisterhood, using figures like Audre Lorde and sort of quotes from Audre Lorde about community and sisterhood. So it kind of has this sort of veneer sort of progressive sort of feminism. But then actually the logics are basically mirroring the kind of the manosphere logics of like this deep bioessentialism, you know, lots of evolutionary theory for explaining that men are hardwired to behave in a certain way, women are hardwired in another way. So, you know, it's often sometimes overtly transphobic, but always kind of implicitly transphobic because of this incredibly bioessentialist idea of how gender works. And so it's this I'm trying to think about how the kind of, well, I guess what Naomi Klein calls the kind of mirror world of online culture is maybe meaning that some of these kind of ostensibly feminist iterations are sort of taking on these logics of bioessentialism, this kind of red pill logics of kind of you know, brutal realism, life is unfair, you just have to wake up to the truth, which speaks a lot to what you were saying about the kind of get real, grow up kind of logic, which underpins so many of these enemy feminisms. So I guess, it's just a question about what's conjuncturally specific about enemy feminisms now, and do you see a kind of role that media logics might be playing? Wow, sorry, that's a lot of questions. So obviously, just respond to whichever.
Thanks. And I'm so curious to hear the rest of yours as well. It's just these were wonderful comments. So the broad church, thank you for bringing all of this up around Loretta Ross and the Reproductive Justice Coalition, which with its insistence that it does have some room for people with who oppose abortion as long as they don't support criminalization. And the thing I always think about that when people say it, which is, it might seem facetious, but I always wonder what the church metaphor, I know it's really common. I know it's really common in politics to talk about a church, a broad church. What do churches want to do? Do they have a project in the world, or is it a place of prayer? I genuinely wonder if it would clarify things if we agreed that the church, the building we're putting this metaphor in, has to have a defined purpose. Now, reproductive justice presumably is the church here, but does reproductive justice, as I believe it must, in order to fulfill its definition of the freedom to gestate, to not gestate, and to raise the children we have in a safe and healthy environment. Now, that to me is a description, if you go far enough into what some of those descriptors like safe would mean, that I can make that mean I'm sort of misspeaking there. I think the proper way of interpreting that is that it necessarily means the deprivatization of care, the communization of care outside of the private nuclear house. I mean, of course I would say that, because my reading of feminism as a historic project is that its antagonist, in a sense, its proper antagonist is the private household. That's what I think feminism is, you know, in a sense, the deprivatization of care. Of course, that's not what everyone has said feminism is, as I've indicated, right? But for me, reproductive justice, you know, yeah, I don't mind if someone wants to struggle alongside us towards certain kinds of, maybe, I don't know, social democratic provisioning. I don't particularly put my efforts towards campaigns for social democratic state provisioning, but I get why, if you are interested in, so that's why people think they can be in the church, right? Because they support generous child support provisions and you know, these sensible things, which is why Elizabeth Bruenig at the, you know, the socialist at the New York Times, who is anti-abortion, is in this kind of conversation as well. But I don't, sorry, I'm not being very clear. I think what I'm trying to say is that that you can say that you're in the same building if you're not precise about what the ultimate aim is. And there are campaigns where that's fine, that's appropriate. But I don't think she means, now I don't want to speak for Loretta what she means, but my understanding is that she's talking about the smaller scale campaigns, not the ultimate goal. And why I agree with Charlotte Shane and the sort of the absolutism of our own is that you can't be comrades with someone who minimizes the seriousness of your forced gestational labor, in my opinion. You know, someone who minimizes the violence involved in forcing someone to birth cannot be in my church. And I don't go to church. So I don't know, that's kind of what I would say about that. And I think it's a false, I don't know, it's like, I don't know, what's the word, like a false economy or something, like it's a false perception of a gain, I would say. It might, yeah. But then also the other comment also probably something about the possibility of making those alliances for specific, you know, legal battles or whatever. Sure, that's what politics, I mean, you know, yeah, there are all kinds of people who fight on other issues who are coming together against genocide right now, and that's appropriate, you know. Yeah.
No, I think that distinction between kind of short-term and long-term aims,
Yeah,
I think that's really helpful.
and yeah, God, Jilly, you said so many interesting things that I scribbled down about. So this, yeah, both of your work about, yeah, I mean, Victoria, I was worried that when you read that chapter on pro-life feminism, you might think, well, she's just cribbed me, you know, because I really was just, I mean, I have this giant quote from you in it, don't I? I tried to pay respects. It's a very, very good article in Radical Philosophy called How is this even a thing, right? Anti-abortion feminism. And, you know, everything Victoria just said, I think that's right. The thing that most feminists have said about pro-life feminists' claims to having a long lineage in feminism is that's nonsense. And there was a sort of fight going on about how, you know, Susan B. Anthony would not have been pro-life or whatever. And I kind of looked into that a bit, and it's just, no, our team is wrong on this. Sorry, like it's a bit, you know, I can kind of get why that fight plays out, but it's sort of, it's depressing that there are people like Erica Bakayoko, who's a kind of, what's she called, the name for that legal philosophy. What's it called? A Catholic, the form of, anyway, there's a revival of a certain kind of social democratic, Wollstonecraftian Catholicism. And Brunig is also kind of wrapped up in this. And Bakioki is one of the, genuinely, it's not an exaggeration to say, one of the architects of the fall of Roe versus Wade. She amassed amicus brief with loads and loads of feminists to make the feminist case to the Supreme Court about how women are only harmed by abortion. And it is this culture of cheapness, and it sounds very lefty in certain moments, like if we really valued life and we weren't neoliberal, work obsessed, market oriented individuals who didn't value care, then we would obviously not kill innocent fetuses. And Victoria does an amazing job of really thinking about what it is that is being said here. Like, how far down that road in that church can you go with someone? Lots of mixed metaphors. What's the point where the things that sound like they're the same become this, become the of fools thing, right? The very scary fascist opposite. People will often scoff at the idea that there's dangers around the so-called red-brown possibility, the fascism, the brown shirt, the socialist rhetoric of the brown shirt. But I see it in our culture a lot, and not just in the sort of so-called MAGA communist people who are very, gaining scary numbers of followers right now, but also, and this might sound a bit nuts, a little bit even in moments, fringes of the trad wife cultural. Now that sounds really not right, does it? Because how could you possibly say there's anything left in that mix, right? But if you look at it, there's often talking points about around the domination of work and the desire to find some kind of it's obviously still work, and sometimes they even admit that, to be in the home, but the narrative that they're pushing, which is quite attractive to many people, alienated, overworked, and disgusted with the sort of pressures, the violence of the wage relation, is that in your homestead with your hideous print dress and your your inexplicably handmade mozzarella or whatever, you have some respite, right, from the from all of that, and that's something quite dangerous for the left not to have its own coherent anti-work answer to, right, a version of, right. Anyway, and that's why I think, anyway, so your work, Jilly, on femcells and the reactionary feminists, and this really peculiar female dating strategy set of discourses that calls itself feminist, and which I too would be hard pressed a while ago, to see what could possibly be the case for its feminisness. I think you're right that there's this mirroring dynamic. So if what's he called, Andrew Tate, says that XYZ is good for men, i.e. What does he say is good for men? Like domination, I think that's what he says.
I think so.
Yeah, and certainly, like eating pussy is gay, right? Yeah. And so nothing could be gayer.
Just having sex without having children is gay. You have to get somebody pregnant, otherwise it's That's what he said recently.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. He said it's just pee-pee sex because your semen is not impregnating anybody. That's what he said. Anyway, that's an aside.
Extraordinary. So yeah, I mean, I think
Sorry.
no. But so I think, yeah, I mean, so Mary Harrington is another interesting figure who almost admits this mirror. I think I was going to get to that, where I think she talks about one of her tropes. Do you know Mary Harrington? Feminism Against Progress is the name of her book. Self-described reactionary feminist. And her book contains such gems as No More Freedom. She talks about history as being, and this is, she's not dumb. I kind of get what she's pointing to in history when she says that there is a fight in feminism between team freedom and team care. And she's on team care, well, she says, which is very interesting for those of us who for some time have been asking questions about possible dangers in the so-called care turn, if it's uncritical and romanticizing. Because Mary Harrington, the worst person on earth, is team care in her own mind, because she thinks that care is being not, and Louise Perry too, that not asking of your nature something that is not sort of good for it. So women need to just get real about our skulls being smaller and our and weaker and crushable by Tate-like thumbs. And our cells have these desires for babies, and being good to that means sort of, I'm almost thinking of it as like making yourself into the shape that Andrew Tate's shape is best fitted to look after, like a sort of so what's good for women is being possessively, abusively contained, maybe. Sorry, I'm actually riffing really stupidly right now, sorry. But I think the case she's making about, a certain kind of opposition. So in my book, I talk about the tensions that sometimes arise between care and autonomy. And I try and put both, that, some species of Marxist that I maybe am, I think that's how one has to think about dialectics of care and autonomy. I try and put both in my definition of love. I say in Abolish the Family that to love is some kind of simultaneous striving for someone's maximal immersion in care, insofar as care is possible in the present historic circumstances, as well as their maximal immersion in a kind of autonomy. And I think that, maybe that's why this species of Marxism that I embody maybe is utopian. I don't think utopia is a bad word. I think there are colonial utopias, decolonial utopias. Utopia as a method for me is that commitment to the abolition of the present state of things, which means that you don't make this Burkean counter-revolutionary gesture that I think a lot of these people are making to be reasonable, don't go crazy, and settle down on one side. Settle for care rather than freedom, which means no contraception, no easy divorce, homesteading, and what does she say? She says that sex is only good if there's the threat, the danger, the dark, she calls it dark.
Yeah.
Dark danger of impregnation.
Yes, yeah, the sort of thrill that
Yeah, it's not sexy otherwise. That's what's good for women, the frisson of your own undoing by a fetus.
Yeah, so her slogan is it her make sex consequential again?
That's right. Yeah. make sex consequential again. Sorry, I'm getting a little, so yeah, anyway, maybe we should, what do you think? Say more.
What's the time? Because I know that you wanted to.